Okay. So this part of the presentation was very very difficult to actually prepare for. And one of the reasons for that was that a lot of the previous debates and conversations about learning styles have now been questioned in terms of whether that actually is a thing. So one of the things that I wanted to really kind of like think about was, if learning style is something that is up for debate, the thing that we kind of know isn't up for debate is more about how we teach. And one of the things that I noticed when I was a Sabbath school teacher was the environment that the children were coming into. They were coming into a room that had several different age groups sitting in different parts of the room, all of them learning different lessons. The noise levels were very loud. We had people who had learned the lesson, had gone through it during the week, knew what the memory verse was, and was, you know, coming in ready and prepared to do the work. They'd arrived on time and they were ready to go. And then we had other people in the group who maybe this was their first time in a Sabbath school. They might not know the kind of like lessons that we were going to be teaching. They didn't have the book. They hadn't done any of the kind of preparation. And you had people across the spectrum in terms of their behavioural difficulties and the way that they displayed their behaviour, and people's learning needs were very different as well. And so as a Sabbath school teacher, being aware of some people learn this way and some people learn that way was very was kind of like an abstract concept to what you actually had sitting in that room with you, knowing that you had a time frame to deliver a lesson, that you had to make sure that everybody left knowing what that message had been about, and that you needed to kind of conserve your energy, because it was going to be quite a roller coaster of a ride, trying to keep everybody engaged. So one of the things that I thought was really helpful in the resource packs that we had was that the learning styles that had been chosen were ones that were much more thinking about this, which is the way how people learn. And the way how we actually teach according to the order, whether it's a lower order thinking skill we're trying to teach or a higher order thinking skill, fitted really well with this. And so when I'm going to be talking now, this is how I'm going to be connecting the two. So on the diagram, you can see Bloom's taxonomy. And what Bloom had done was looked at the kind of like learning process and seeing that there were different levels to it. And that with the lower order thinking, it's very much about just getting a hold of the information and being able to kind of like say it back, and not necessarily have any idea about what you've learned. And over a period of time, this will be easily forgotten, and right up to being able to take what you've learned and then use that to build something new, and that would be where you have create. So if we think about the different levels on here, we will know that there are some things
Tessa, sorry to interrupt. Are you meant to be sharing your screen with us?
Oh, is it not showing? Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you for telling me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So glad you said that now. Great, sorry. So as you can see from Bloom's taxonomy, there's lower order thinking and there's higher order thinking. And at the bottom end, we have in the purple, remember, and at the top end, we have the creativity piece. Now, all of us will have our own preferences in terms of which bits are easier for us to do. And some of that was to do with the way how we've been taught. So some people were taught literally by rote. And so the kind of like going to a lecture, getting the information, copying it down, highlighting it, and then referring to it at a later date, just rereading it is a strategy that they find most useful in terms of kind of like learning. But for the kind of more modern way of learning things, people are being told about all of these levels and being able to take from that basic level of remembering and taking it all the way up to the ability to be able to, and so what does this mean? How can I then use this to kind of guide where I'm going? So the next level up, once you've actually remembered what the information is to actually to be able to understand it. And that means that being able to actually describe it, summarize it, explain it to somebody else. And in terms of the previous information that we were talking about in terms of that zone of proximal development, this is what it was talking about, being able to understand some information, whether it's from a adult or another peer, if they can then explain it to somebody who doesn't understand, it helps with their learning, but it also helps with the new person who's trying to learn that information as well. Once you understand it, you then need to be able to apply it. So having understood this concept, it's like, what does this actually look like in action? Can we actually demonstrate it? So one of the things that you will see with this level will be how to turn something into something. So if you have a recipe that you are actually following the instructions, you have made the ingredients into the cake, then you are applying your learning about how to use the oven, how to read instructions, how to actually, bake a cake. The next level is the analysis. And again, if you've understood something, you will then be able to see it in smaller steps and being able to see why something comes before the other step, and if there's a way of you being able to fast track or do it slightly differently in order to make it work in a different way or to work quicker. And then you evaluate and assess, maybe hypothesize about other situations that you could use this in, and then you can use that to create. So how these then fitted with the 4 learning styles that were mentioned in the handout was that the innovative and imaginative learner, they're interested in the personal meaning and making of those connections. So they want to be at the level where we are applying the information, they are analyzing the information, and they're able to evaluate it. They want to understand the reasons for learning, and they want to see how that can then become new information that they can then apply to their own situation. So this particular model of thinking is that it's not just a case of learning information and then that's it, you know it, but it's about being able to say, so what does this mean for me? And then the analytic learner is interested in acquiring facts in order to deepen their understanding of the concepts and the processes. So once we are able to generalize, we are in a position where we can understand and analyze. So these two models are showing you that even though people might have a different learning style, there will be elements of Bloom's taxonomy that's going to help them to be able to learn in a way that makes sense for them. And this is the reason why I think that this particular approach is a more helpful way of thinking about learning styles than thinking about what has been kind of called the kind of like kinetic and the visual and the auditory, because they're ways of conveying information, but they're not actually ways in terms of learning in the real world. So when you are thinking about common sense learning, for example, which is the third element, they're interested in how things get done. How do you get it? How do you try it? How do you evaluate it, analyze it, and then create and do something with it? That's an actual doing way of learning. And it would be really helpful for that person to be able to watch something being demonstrated, to be able to have instructions which are written and have drawings. So there are lots of different ways of getting information across that isn't just thinking about I'm a visual learner, or I'm a kinetic learner, or I'm a, you know, auditory learner. And then the final way of learning was talking about dynamic, and this was somebody who was self-directed, and they preferred to try and go into this evaluation level where they're exploring and they're learning by trial and error in terms of creation. Now, what these models show is that by breaking it down into those different levels, there are different actions that you can take that will help you to turn the basic information into something that is applicable for any one of these 4 learning styles. And at this day and age where we're using digital tools, it's really important to think about which one of the tools is going to be the most effective in order to help this young person to learn. I'm really sorry, but my throat has just got really dry. Just going to have a drink. Okay. So one of the things that I thought was really important when I was thinking about this element of taking an idea of learning style and then thinking about, so how do you help somebody who has that particular style of learning to actually learn about the different topics that we'll be teaching them? And if we're thinking about where are they on the scale, so is this somebody who likes to evaluate, or is this somebody who likes to understand, then we can think very carefully about which of these particular strategies is going to be the most useful for them, but also to be thinking about, we want them to travel through all of these levels. So even if they are somebody who prefers to think in a particular way, maybe the analytical level, that we also need them to be able to create, and we also need them to be able to show that they can apply. And the ways to do that would be to use a variety of these different strategies, so that we're moving from lower order thinking up into higher order thinking. And these different techniques will be, some of them we can do in the kind of like class environment, and some of these will be things that will be done as homework tasks, and some of these will be things that we'll be kind of like thinking about in terms of the material that we've already got. So one of the things that is really helpful about the Sabbath school lessons and the, you know, the VBS programs, all of those different programs, is that people have already thought about the different levels of learning and the different ways that people learn, and they've made sure that each of the exercises covers 2 or 3 of these different things, so that we are moving from lower order thinking up to the higher order thinking. So one of the other things that I really found quite interesting when I was doing the research on this particular idea was that when we think about learning, there are particular strategies that, whatever your learning style, these will help you to be able to retain information. And if we are thinking about how to actually help children and young people to learn, then these are the kinds of strategies that we need to be kind of thinking about, one, using, so that we're modeling how they actually work, but 2, we're actually teaching them how to put these into practice. So the first one on the diagram, chunking, is thinking about big pieces of information and how to make them into bite-sized elements that people can then hold on to. So we know that this is something that can be done in terms of a story. So if you have a story that has some key themes in it, that you might do an overview of the story. This is a story about blah, 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 blah. And then you'd go into what the actual story was. And then the person would have those key themes to be able to hold the different pieces of information that you've provided in place. And so they would have a much better idea about the bigger picture. So when we are preparing for a presentation, is thinking about what are the things that we want the person to walk away with, and then how can we make sure that we flag those up at the beginning and then go into the story in more detail. Interleaving is thinking about how to not just follow one particular kind of idea only, but to have 2 or 3 things going on at the same time. So an example of this is when you are teaching a skill such as, you know, how to hit a ball, and we might be thinking about, if you're doing tennis, it might be overarm, you know, backstroke. If we were doing swimming, there's 4 different types of swimming moves, and it's thinking about, well, how would you be able to help someone to learn if you wanted to mean that they could have a more kind of like balanced overview. So what you would do in those situations would be that you would do 2 or 3 different types of movements at the same time. So you might do 1 length of forward, backstroke, and then you might do 1 length of butterfly, and then you might do 1 length of the front crawl. And the idea would be that because they're all swimming moves, they're all techniques, different techniques that they need to learn, but rather than doing 10 lengths of one, 10 lengths of the other one, that because they're moving from one to the other, it means that they're really having to think every time they do a slightly different one, okay, this time I have to remember my breathing, or this time I have to remember to do you know, my arms in this particular way. And it just means that they really will retain the information in a different way, because they're having to kind of like switch from one to another throughout the process, and they're getting regular revisions every time they then come back to the original move. So it's quite easy to kind of see how, by just using these 2 strategies, that regardless of which of the kind of like learning styles that you have, that these different techniques are going to help you with your understanding in terms of that hierarchy, that you're going to be moving from the remembering higher up into the kind of analysing and the creativity elements of things. So then the next one is thinking about multi-sensory. So a lot of the kind of like learning that children will do will be through a mixture of singing and drawings, writing things down, looking at videos, listening to a story, and the idea being that by mixing things that you're much more likely to hold on to it than if you only have one particular form of information sharing. And this was tested out when they were asking people to remember some random objects, and they showed them the pictures of the objects and then took the pictures away and then asked them to recall what the objects were, and people were able to remember some. And other, the next time they did it, they had the words as well as the pictures, and people remembered more. And so that was part of the kind of like showing that just having a particular model, as in the learning style approach, where people were saying that people were auditory or kinetic, was only using that kind of like one sense, and that actually people need to have multiple senses in order to be able to really understand and to be able to connect the information. And then the next idea that people have talked a lot about is spaced repetition. That one of the things that we kind of like do is in things like when we're doing memory verses and any other kind of revision, is thinking about how do you practice in a way that helps you to keep it front and center, but gives you enough time to begin to forget about it, but then you have to recall it and bring it back in order to kind of like make it stick in your mind. And so one of the things that they talk about in terms of spaced repetition is thinking about doing things on a kind of like regular basis and then spacing it out slightly longer and longer until you get to a place where you're able to remember it for weeks at an end. So if we think about the Sabbath lessons are in, like quarters, and thinking about how often do we go back to what we learned on week 1, week 4, week 7, how would we be able to kind of integrate the kind of recall, practicing those kind of memory verses between each of the different weeks, so that people are remembering as they go along the different lessons that they've learned during that particular kind of quarter. And then the final test is thinking about how to develop a way of learning through questions. So when we have a particular story or an idea, is to think about how can I turn this into questions. And so you would encourage the child or the young person to think about some of the key themes and to turn those into questions that they would then use as kind of a flashcard in order to remember that particular topic. And one of the things that is really important for learning is to keep on testing yourself. So when you read information and you think that you've got it, if you just keep rereading it, then because you're familiar with the material, then you'll think that you actually have it contained in your mind, but actually you don't. And so when you have to ask yourself a question about it, then that will put you in a different headspace to be able to really stop and reflect and think, do I actually know this piece of information? And if you have these kind of flashcards that you will test yourself on over a period of time, these are the things that you would use for your spaced repetition to remind you that you have actually learned this material. And then if you find that you thought you had it, but then you have forgotten it, is to then bring up the things that you're forgetting more often until you can get back to a place where you feel that you've got it back in the center of your mind. So those were the kind of 5 techniques that I thought were important and applicable across the different learning styles, across the different age ranges, and are things that we can put into practice quite easily in terms of how we present the information that we have. And I think the last page is references of the different sources for the information that I've presented today. Some of these are, focused on adult techniques, but these are applicable for young people as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Tessa, for that whistle-stop tour on child development and learning styles. It's certainly given us a lot to think about. And I do believe we have a few questions which I've asked people to place in the chat. The first one comes from Julia in Torquay, and she says, how does social anxiety affect a child 11 to 13 years?
So in terms of the impact of emotional elements on our ability to kind of like interact with the world, social anxiety is usually a young person who finds it uncomfortable in certain situations. So there may be some areas where they're excelling, small groups, they're fine. But if they have to, go into a shop and ask for something, they might find that difficult. Or if they're in a group of strangers, then they will become very withdrawn. So it would very much depend on the child's themselves, as in how it's affecting them, and then it would be like what's the issue. So if it's affecting their social interaction in the school environment, they're not answering questions in class, they're not able to concentrate because they're always worried that someone's going to kind of like pick on them, then one of the things that works for social anxiety is cognitive behavioral therapy, where it helps the child to learn about one, what is happening in their body that makes them feel that they're highly anxious, stressed, I'm not able to concentrate, that they learn how to actually manage that feeling, the sensation, the physical sensation. It helps them to think about the thought processes that they're going through. I'm really stupid, I don't know the answers to the question, oh my gosh, what if the teacher asked me this? How that's helpful or unhelpful for them. And then what it will teach them is alternative strategies, alternative thought processes that they can put in place in order to become more confident in their abilities to manage in those situations.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. Taking in consideration that the autistic spectrum is so wide, how soon should a parent or an adult realize that a child is SEN? Are there obvious signs that one should be looking out for?
So in terms of the autistic spectrum, that gets diagnosed at particular age based on certain criteria. So I guess what usually happens in family systems is that the family will notice that the child is not doing something that they would expect them to do. So it could be in how they're interacting with their peers, or depending on whether they've got, they're verbal or not, particular traits. They might be obsessed with particular activities and very difficult to move away from those tasks, or they might find it very difficult if you said you're going shopping and then something happens and you have to do something else. So depending on how your child is operating, you could be working with a high functioning child who will be able to cope with mainstream education and may just need a few adjustments in order to be able to manage the social interaction side, or you could have somebody who's going to need input from a very young age, because they're not verbal, they're not able to engage in learning in the way that other children are, and they will need to have additional help from maybe speech and language, or from somebody who's going to be able to teach them particular learning strategies in order to engage in education. So I think it would very much depend on how the child is presenting and whether they're at an age and stage where they could be diagnosed by somebody, and usually it would come out either very young in the child from health visitor, doctor, child development centre, because of their behind, or if it's an older child, it would be picked up in school in terms of how they're interacting with their peers or engaging with learning.
Okay, and there are a number of questions about the slide. So at the end of the day, we will be putting up a slide where you can, with our contact details. So if you make a note of that, then we can make sure that we can get information to you. And then there was another, not so much a comment, but a question. And we absolutely don't mind comments. And the sister says, I think testing is something that goes on in school, but if Sabbath school is practical and interesting, the children will be able to apply what they learn without needing to be tested on it. It is, well, it will just become part of living over the years. Any reflections on that? And I'm sure any teachers in the room will probably have a view on that too.
Yeah, I was thinking that's really kind of like an interesting idea in terms of whether testing is something that we need to do or not, because I'm thinking that in terms of most things in life, whether you're learning how to drive a car or learning how to cook, there's usually some benchmark that you've got that lets you know whether you've learned the skill or not learned the skill. So I understand the kind of like the idea behind it. You don't have to test, but I'm thinking that we probably do need to have some way of kind of gauging our kind of like understanding of the material, whether it's, you know, I definitely know all the books of the Bible or not. You know, how would we know whether somebody had understood something?
Yes, a good point. And then an interesting point here from one of our Sabbath school leaders I recognize. She makes the comment that many pupils are undiagnosed until they begin to be excluded from education.
Yeah, and that's quite often the case with either a learning need, or if they've got particular things like a hyperactivity attention deficit, because some behaviors come across as naughtiness when actually it's to do with you know, too much information, or things are being done in a way that the child's just not able to engage in. So a lot of the problems, the parents have usually been complaining about it for a long time, but have not been listened to. And more recently, the changes that have come into schools in terms of the ability to do those assessments that say whether a young person can get extra help in the school environment, it's harder and harder to meet the criteria now. So a lot of people are ending up just having to get by when they've got clear signs of dyslexia or a learning need, but because it's not meeting a particular criteria, they're just left to kind of like languish. So it is really hard, I think, for parents these days to get their child's needs met in some school environments.
And it's such a complex issue, because Sister Vicky says, my autistic son knows all the books of the Bible, but whether he has a heart for God, I don't know. Well, we will certainly be praying that he does. They can't be fully tested. Yeah, that can't be fully tested.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We've got a couple more minutes if anyone wants to lob in a question, and you can ask it rather than type it. If not, we will thank Tessa and listen to some music before we have our next presentation.
I just wanted to ask,
yes, Pastor.
well, first of all, to thank Sister Tessa for her wonderful presentation. And I want you to know that I've noted your name. So I'll certainly be in contact. With you. there's always this thing around culture,
Yes.
and how learning takes place, how one presents themselves, how children behave depending on the culture. For example, like in the Afro-Caribbean culture or so, children will tend to gesticulate a lot when they are making a point, and teachers can probably take that as being aggressive. Just recently, I had to actually go into school to talk to the teacher concerning my son, who, he's very tall and he has a deep voice, but he's just 12. Very powerfully built, he plays football. So, one day she spoke to him, and he stood up because she asked him to stand up, and he stood up, and of course he was towering over her, and she thought that was a bit intimidating. So, he got a detention point for just being who he is. How do we sort of navigate that, and because this would be maybe a challenge that will come to our Sabbath school teachers as well. When different people from different cultures come to Sabbath school, maybe if you can say a word on that, because
I think it's a really difficult one, because I have been a social worker since 1993, and children were getting excluded from that age, from that stage of my career. But as a young person in school, I was watching people around me facing that situation, and it tends to be the boys of a certain age that will get labeled in that particular way. And then when you have a group of Black children in Sabbath school and they're behaving in particular ways, how much of that is down to when they're in the school, they're treated in this way. Now they're at Sabbath school, they're behaving in a different way, or they feel, oh, it's different here. At least the teachers are Black, and so I can behave in a different way. They'll understand me. And I think it's one of those things that there's been a lot written about it, but not very much has changed. And I really struggle with it, because I think that as a trainee therapist, I was being judged in terms of the way I was sitting, the way I was talking, the speed that I talk at, all of those things. And that's me as an adult training to do a very specialized job. So I think that one of the messages my mom was really clear about with me was, if there is a problem in school with the teachers, please do not get involved in a conversation with them. Tell me about it and let me speak to them. Because if they label you as rude, or they label you as having an attitude problem, once you're labeled, it's really difficult for you to then to be able to do, okay, I need you in school learning, not in school in detention. And so that's how kind of like my mom dealt with it. And she was quite happy to be the children were being at.
I think your internet is frozen slightly, Tessa. Give it a few seconds.
I have lost reception. Hello?
We can hear you now. You did freak out for a while.
Yes, yeah, I'm so sorry. So I don't know if that was very helpful.
Yeah, so you're telling us how your mother dealt with it. And Pastor Thomas and others on the platform, I'm quite mature in age, and I remember sort of 45 plus years ago, the same challenges, particularly having come from South America as a young child and being called names and only feeling aggression to respond. And this is really quite tough. It comes back to what Dr. Coe was saying earlier, spending time with children. And I think a lot more has to go into, and I don't say this in a critical way at all, because it's hard for them. It's difficult, particularly for young boys when the hormones are kicking in and everything else. But having conversations, this is where male role models and very strong mothers too are important, to talk to them And it's not about Bible bashing, but how their behavior and mannerisms can be perceived by women, perhaps by women in different cultures, people who are not the same stature as they are, so that they begin to reflect on that. And that's going to be tough because it means holding back the emotions and thinking before, I said, not even lashing out in an aggressive way. It's just, how do you balance that with them denying who they are?
Exactly. And I think that's
the difficult balance.
That is it. And for most people, we shouldn't have to do that. We feel we shouldn't have to do that. But what I think we have to remember is the teachers have got their degrees already, and we need to get ours. And so in order to do that, sometimes you have to play the system. And it's knowing how to play the system, but not lose yourself. That is the thin line, I think, and a really tough one for parents to actually help their children to cope with life. Because I think it's one of the tough lessons that Black children and other children who are different to the main culture have to face, that a lot of the mainstream children, whether they're males or white males or whatever it is the predominant culture is, that they don't have to consider these things.
Yes, and we have another very interesting comment, which is, I guess it boils down to what work is being done with education to change the attitudes and perception that some teachers have towards, minority ethnic children. And the comment says, we have to be advocates for the children. That's so important. Teachers and schools need to learn to accept them and meet them where they are instead of the other way around. And that's a tough one, Sister Karen. It has such a negative impact on children after school when teachers act in this way. It certainly does. And that's where we have to invest overtime so that we are a release. They can talk to us as parents about their frustrations, and at least they know that there's a point of contact where they can, express themselves.
Mm.
Can I just ask a question? Yes, some of my Sabbath school teachers have brought up that they are noticing they would like their students all to respect each other, because some of our students in our Sabbath schools have, like what we said before, are SEN, and some are not, and they would like a way, as you said at the beginning of your presentation, Tessa, that as teachers, we have students from all different backgrounds, but also all different sort of weeks. They don't present all having the same learning style, all knowing the same, having learnt the same thing when they come to Sabbath school. And some of our teachers are just they've actually asked for training on how to deal with cohesion in their classes. What advice would you give?
That is such a hard one to answer in one sentence, but I definitely think a training is the way to go, because I think that there are multiple levels to how you create the right environment for everybody to learn and be treated as an equal, because part of the problem that we can have as Sabbath school teachers is when the parents are literally seeing it as the place to babysit their kids, and they'll just drop them off. They've done no prep, nothing, who cares, it's your problem now, and they're gone. And you're trying to kind of like find a way to manage a child who's basically having to learn everything from scratch in that classroom, and as you said, may also have additional learning needs. So I definitely think it's one where a specific training would really help with that, because then you can be thinking about, what do we do with parents, what's our expectations of the young people, what kind of like rules and kind of ways of being, what's the message we want to convey, and how can we see that in action in our classroom. So you would be able to do a shorthand then of, oh, is this an example of us doing our really good listening skills, and they would know what you're talking about if they were talking when they should be listening. So I definitely think that if you can break it down into what are the main problem areas, and then we can problem solve around, or what would be the right strategies for that, because one strategy for working with the parents might be effective for one set of problems, and then there may be something else you actually have to do with the kids signing up to a kind of like an agreement on how they're going to treat each other, might be something else for a different type of behavior.
I think that's really important, and I do hope folks will be able to stay throughout the day, because as I said earlier, the last presentation, which is also an exciting one, is looking at the importance of family commitment in raising children for the kingdom. It's just family commitment and investment is absolutely crucial. And then there's another question here, and we do have a few more minutes, from Sister Pam Hutchinson. How do we balance children holding in the issues and taking them home to mum and being able to respect upwards? When will they learn to speak up in the real world?
Yeah, so I think that part of the parenting role is, how do you teach your children to have a conversation that is polite and appropriate according to their age and stage, and also about who they're talking to? Because obviously, you know, thank God we're not in America, where, you know, you say the wrong thing to someone and you actually could end up getting shot for it. But we are still in an environment where people have the equivalent of that trigger happy finger of the getting excluded, and if you're out of the classroom, you're not learning. So it's trying to you know, think about, can you have the conversation in the live moment? Is it something that you talk about afterwards? Is it something that you would have, you and your parent would go to the school to just ask for some clarity on that particular issue? So I think it's very much going to depend on the age of the child, what the actual issue is, and who it is, because it might be one class teacher and they just have to suck it up that that's going to happen in French, or it could be it's a school philosophy that they treat people in that way, in which case then it's not a child's issue, it's a parent's issue, in terms of who has that conversation. Because I've had quite a few situations where children are being expected to deal with things that are adult issues, and that the parents don't have the skills to deal with it, but they're expecting that their children will be able to manage it. So I think it would depend on age, who the person is that they are trying to have a conversation with, and thinking about when to have that conversation.
Okay, thank you. We are out of time for questions. Sister Vicky, I see your question there relating to the Grace-Link philosophy. I think we should hold on that until after the next presentation. So Tessa, I'd like to thank you so much for that two excellent presentations where you broke down you know, how children learn, how they develop, and then took us through the learning styles. That was really very interesting, and it's evidence from the feedback we've been receiving in the chat. So I look forward to doing more work with you in the future. Thank you for your time, and may God continue to bless you and your ministry.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.